next guest has inspired today's survey question at Smerconish.com. I'm asking, should police be banned from making traffic stops based on secondary offenses, such as inspection stickers or think one non-working brake light? The headline from Philadelphia is getting lots of attention. Philly, says the Inquirer, has become the first big city to ban minor traffic stops said to criminalize, quote, driving while black. The author is City Council member Isaiah Thomas, who joins me now. Councilman, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And of course, thank you to your listening audience as well.
So what was the motivation for you to take this action?
So first of all, for me, it starts with lived experiences. I'm born and raised in the city of Philadelphia. I love my city. I represent my city as a council member at large. But unfortunately, for far too many people who look like me that come from where I come from, being pulled over by police is a rite of passage. It's something that we assimilate as a part of our culture. It's a part of our norm. And as we begin to matriculate and grow up, you realize that it shouldn't be a rite of passage because it's not a rite of passage for everybody. And that was the foundation of the legislation as far as where I'm coming from. The data also supports the legislation when we looked at how disproportionately people of color were pulled over compared to other demographics, specifically looking at the number of Black men that have been pulled over in the city of Philadelphia. And then when we looked at how little we find either a weapon in or contraband, we decided to let the data drive the conversation as it relates to trying to rectify one of the ills that we have in our municipality.
In your case, when you've been pulled over, did you think it was pretextual? Did you think you were really being pulled over because you're Black?
Which time? I think that's the real question. Far too often, we get pulled over that you can reference different times when different things happen. Have I ever committed a traffic violation? Absolutely. Have I ever been pulled over when I know I didn't commit a traffic violation? Absolutely. But again, someone like me that 37 years old, I've been driving for about 20 years now. I've been pulled over more than one time per year on average. That is a fact. And so every time I have been pulled over, I do believe that the majority of those stops were actually racially motivated. They only take place in certain neighborhoods. And it put me in a position and other people in a position where we become very uncomfortable as it relates to interacting with law enforcement.
How have you personally handled that instance? Have you said anything, or do you just show them license, registration, and insurance and get on with it?
It depends on your phase of your life. When you're in your late teens and early 20s, when you first begin to drive, you definitely want to show them everything. You want to do the things that you were told in the talks that you have with either your father or older brothers, uncles, or mentors. So when you're early on and you're young, you're doing everything you can to get out of that situation as safely as possible. I think as you get a little older and get a little wiser and you get used to those situations, you begin to get a little more comfortable handling them. And then once you get closer to my age or in the position that I'm in, you often just try to show identification that would try to not just de-escalate the situation as fast as possible, but show the type of identification that will put you in a position where you can be as efficient with your time and try to leave the traffic stop as soon as possible. So I've had it happen in multiple phases of my life, whether it was me being a city employee or me being a young driver in the city of Philadelphia or a working professional. And I think that the status of where you are and what's going on with you at the time determines how you often handle it.
So the data that you referenced a moment ago, I think, is this, that the Philadelphia Inquirer published. In Philadelphia, Black drivers account for 72% of those stopped for vehicle code violations by police officers during the one-year period ending in September of 2019, despite African Americans making up only 43% of the city's population, according to Councilmember Thomas's office, and that's obviously you. Question, might that be more economic than racial? Might that be driven by economic conditions in the community as compared to the city at large?
I don't think that's a bad theory. I think when you look at some of the socioeconomic issues that we face as a municipality, we do know that we are the poorest large city in the entire country. We do know that poverty is something that disproportionately impacts people of color. So there probably will be a correlation between socioeconomic status and the type of traffic stops that we're talking about. But I do want to be clear, people of a number of different socioeconomic statuses travel throughout the course of the city of Philadelphia. I myself do not come from a family of poverty. My father is a teacher and someone who was a professional my entire life. I actually never lived in some of the most impoverished neighborhoods of the city of Philadelphia. But even me, I'm put in a position where I've been stopped multiple times. And I think often what happens is when you do not come from a position of poverty and your parents put you in a position where you can actually afford some things that are beneficial and are nice, to be honest with you, you often are reluctant to show those things off and to use those things because it puts you in a position where you only blame yourself. And that's something that becomes a cultural norm. When I was driving a gift from my parents after I graduated from college and I used to get pulled over often, I used to look at myself and say, that's my fault. I shouldn't have been driving that car at that time. And I'm not the only one that operate in that capacity. When you're a young Black man growing up in the city of Philadelphia, you pick your car based on trying to purchase one that puts you in a position to get pulled over as least as possible. So I'm not going to act like socioeconomic status has absolutely nothing to do with it, but I do want to be clear. When someone's getting pulled over, you can't tell their socioeconomic status. We've seen it with entertainers, we've seen it with athletes, we've seen it with millionaires, and we've seen it with people who are living in poverty.
So the Defender Association says that 97%, this is stunning to me, 97% of police vehicle stops are for low-level violations. This could lead to, your initiative in City Council could lead to as many as 300,000 fewer police encounters each year. When I read that, I wondered, what do the police think? Are they happy to hear this, or do they think that you're now tying their hands behind their back from a law enforcement standpoint?
Well, we don't want to tie their hands. We want to do a couple of things. The first thing we want to do is put us in a position where we're addressing the civil rights issue. The second thing we want to do is put law enforcement in a position where they're not spread as thin. We ask law enforcement to do a lot in the city of Philadelphia, and we're seeing a spike as it relates to crime. The traffic stops that you just talked about, the majority of the time, well over the majority of the time, we're not seeing any contraband and or weapons, but we're also forcing those officers to enforce these motor vehicle code violations. So the goal is to put us in a position where we can develop more trust between communities of color and law enforcement, to also put us in a position where law enforcement is not being asked to do as much as they're asked to do because it's spreading them way too thin. We want to put us in a position where we can ask police officers to focus on high crime and significant crime that takes place. And I think that this bill is a step in that direction.
Councilman, I actually pulled the ordinance that you're responsible for, just so I would know exactly. It's a little bit of legalese, and I'm hoping you can just explain to all of us in lay terms. So what are we actually talking here? What secondary offenses that previously you might get pulled over for are you no longer going to get pulled over in the future?
So in the future, because it's not signed into law by the mayor, we're hoping that that happens sometime soon. What we're looking at is we're looking at a couple different violations. Number one, think about a seatbelt. For us in the city of Philadelphia, you're not pulled over for a seatbelt not being on. But if you're speeding or if you run a stop sign and your seatbelt just happens to not be on, that motor vehicle code violation is enforced as well too. So what we're doing is we're looking at 7 different things that will go into that secondary category, similar to what we see as a seatbelt. Minor bumper to the damage, a license plate being moved, but still must be visible, obstruction to the mirror as it relates to things that might be dangling from someone's mirror, emission stickers, inspection stickers, 1 broken taillight, and a 60-day grace period on vehicle registration. So those 7 categories would now be placed in the same category that we put a seatbelt in. And the goal is to put us in a position where we can do the things I said earlier as it relates to becoming more efficient, more effective in building community relations.
In other words, in Philadelphia today, you can't get pulled over for a seatbelt violation. But if you're pulled over for, say, speeding and they see you're not wearing a seatbelt, they can write you up for that as well. And so what you're explaining to us is you want to put more things in the category of seatbelt, like the 7 that you just enumerated.
Yes, sir. Exactly.
Okay, so I can hear my father, who's no longer with us as of 3 years ago, saying when I was becoming, a driver, make sure that you've got everything in running order, that you can pass inspection. State inspection at that time used to be twice a year in Pennsylvania, not once a year. And he would always say to me, you got to worry about the guy who has a brake light that's out, because who knows, this would be his logic, Councilman, who knows, maybe his brake system doesn't work so well. Maybe his steering doesn't work so well, and he's just not maintaining that car in a safe and working order. What would you say to that?
Well, the first thing I would say is in 2021, most of the cars that we see today have multiple lights in the back. So when we're talking about one brake light being out, we know that that's something that's not necessarily a public safety hazard. And if it is something that, whereas though it's an older model car and is creating a public safety hazard, whereas though you can't tell if someone's turning or something in that capacity, they can still be pulled over. The other thing that I would have a conversation with your father about and try to go back and forth, and of course, listening to his opinion, is just the idea that some of the violations that he's concerned with as it relates to things like emission stickers and things like that. Well, you really can't see someone's emission stickers being expired when you pull them over to begin with. You have to actually pull the person over first. And then once you walk up on the car, you look at their emission stickers and you see that they are essentially expired. So the taillight, the one taillight being out, we think that that's something that's reasonable and responsible, reasonable in the sense that sometimes people don't know that one taillight is out. And we want to put people in a position where, again, we're trying to build trust and we're being more efficient with our officer time. But then the inspection stickers, again, that's something that you often see once someone is already pulled over. So it somewhat is already in that secondary category anyway.
You're first in the nation, right? I mean, I know this has been a burr in the saddle for the minority community for a long, long time, thinking that these stops are pretextual, that they're being pulled over for driving while black. But you, Philadelphia, the first to actually do something. Do you think you're going to now see other cities fall in line and imitate this?
Well, if other cities want to fall in line and imitate, we're going to be open to having that conversation. But I think our focus right now is making sure we get it right. There's a data component that comes with this that requires a certain level of transparency as it relates to this type of stops and how they're reported. We want to make sure that we monitor that data. We want to look at these violations, and we want to make sure that this is having a positive impact. There's people who are skeptical. Some people are skeptical in a sense, whereas though they think that they will always be pulled over for being driving while black, and they feel like police are going to do what they want regardless. There are other people who are skeptical because they feel like this may have a negative impact on public safety. There are other people who are skeptical because they feel like this doesn't help the relationship between legislators and law enforcement. We recognize all those problems exist, and our goal is to focus on getting this done in a way that's the most effective for the constituents in Philadelphia and all those parties that's involved. Simultaneously, if folks do want to have a conversation to discuss the model, to see where we are and what we're doing, we're going to be open to that dialogue. But let's be clear, our focus is getting right in Philadelphia. We are happy to lead the nation, but that's not our focus. Our focus is getting this issue right and again, addressing a civil rights issue that we know exists for communities of color.
Councilman, I really appreciate your willingness to come on and discuss this. I'm fascinated by it, want to see where it all leads, and I'm appreciative of your time. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for asking the tough questions. And hopefully we can come back and revisit this in a year or so.
Definitely.
Or maybe 6 months to see where we are.
Let's do it.
Thank you.
Let us do that. Thank you.